So in this video, we're going to look at the rather awesome Volkswagen Scirocco. Now, this car was only available in limited regions, namely the European regions. It didn't, as far as I know, make it to North America. So if you're living in North America, this video will really show you what you're missing out. The decision made by Volkswagen not to take it to North America was because they feared that it would harm the Volkswagen Golf sales. It's a similar sized car, similar performance, and it would have appealed to a lot of the drivers that wanted to get the Volkswagen Golf. So let's look at this stunning car, the Volkswagen Scirocco. It originally started way back in the 70s, and the design really was to make a fun car that was stylish and interesting to drive. This original Volkswagen Scirocco was offered in the North American regions, and it came with a massive array of different engine types. But this video, we're really going to focus on the third generation, the interesting model that started in 2008. It really was a stylish departure in terms of design from the Volkswagen Group. It was a very sophisticated looking sporty car. It had two doors. It was clearly not designed to be a family car. The engine choices were rather limited. You had just the 1.4 TSI, a 2-litre TSI engine, and the lovely 2-litre TDI engine. So engine choices were limited, but they chose the best engines, in my opinion. These engines suit the chassis really, really well. So the Volkswagen Scirocco actually shares the PQ35 or the A5 platform, not the Audi A5 platform. That's a model of car. We're talking about the platform. So this platform was shared with the Audi TT, the Audi A3, Volkswagen Golf Mark 5, Mark 6, I think, also used that platform. So it's a very, very popular platform. Now, Volkswagen decided to use a very modular system so they could have one common platform that they based all their models on. And effectively, by bolting different parts on different body panels, they could create completely different looking cars, but still retain the same underpinnings. And from a modifier's point of view, that is fantastic because it means you can go to the Volkswagen parts bin and get parts off the performance variants of these other models that were out there. And chances are they're going to fit because they've been designed to fit this PQ35 or this Volkswagen A5 platform. 6 years after the Volkswagen Scirocco's launch, there was a facelift offered. This really was very, very subtle. Minor changes were made to design elements on the car that just helped to keep the design fresh. Then in 2015, we had the Scirocco GTS, which effectively used the same engine as the Golf GTI. In fact, the only downside I find on the Volkswagen Scirocco is really the rear passengers' access to those seats, because you've got the front doors and the roof line is rather low, so it can make getting in and out rather awkward. But let's face it, if you're buying a Volkswagen Scirocco, it's not to carry passengers around. You want a driver's car. You want a car that you can actually enjoy, and that's why you're here. That's why you're watching this video, so that you can get the best performance out of your Volkswagen Scirocco. So in terms of mods and upgrades for the Volkswagen Scirocco, much of what I've said already for the other Volkswagen Group cars still applies to the Volkswagen Scirocco. There's a few things to be aware of, particularly with regard to suspension upgrades. But first of all, let's talk about engine mods and which engine mods I would really recommend doing to your Volkswagen Scirocco. There's a lot of options out there. People often talk about induction kits, sports exhausts, remaps or engine tunes, flywheels, intercoolers, and fuel pump and fuel upgrades. So they're topics that we're going to discuss here. I'm going to leave the ones that make the biggest difference that I really do recommend to later in this video. We'll just get the ones out of the way first that won't significantly affect the power that you make, but they may make the Scirocco more fun to drive. So first of all, we talk about the very popular air intake mods on the Volkswagen Scirocco. What can you expect from an intake upgrade? Now, it doesn't make a substantial amount of power. If you've done nothing else to your engine, you're wasting your money fitting an induction kit to these. The stock factory fuel filter and intake setup flows more than adequately for the stock engine. When you start to ramp the power up significantly, you will start to hit a restriction, and that's the point you need to think about the intake. So I would still recommend going with a performance panel filter. So this replaces the factory paper filter with a higher flowing one. They're typically made of some sort of cotton gauze material. The main reason a lot of people fit these open cone induction kit filters is because of the lovely induction roar that they create. It really does make the engine sound much more sporty, much more throaty. But the downside of that is the engine can be hard to live with on long drives and long commutes. A lot of people that have had induction kits fitted eventually tire of the noise and the constant drone. So manufacturers have designed their intakes to really minimize the noise that's coming on the intake. So You obviously lose that design feature from the manufacturer, but you are increasing the engine's ability to breathe. So depending on your engine and the other mods you do, you may well be needing to remove a restriction. So a full induction kit is obviously the best way to go. Don't sight it in the engine bay where there's all the warm air. Try and channel it off. Most engine bays, you can put some sort of box mechanism in there to just filter it and have a cold air feed, feeding cold air from outside. Because just remember that cold air has more oxygen and the engine is really needing that oxygen in order to burn the fuel. If the engine is sucking in warm air, it's getting less oxygen and it's going to be down on power. If you've got experience with the full induction kits on these, please let me know. Let me know the models that you fitted or the makes of the induction kit that you fitted. So when it comes to intake upgrades on the Volkswagen Scirocco, there's lots of parts out there. So a few of the names that have been used by our members, people have left comments on this channel on various engine videos that I've done. We see brands like MST, Ram Air, ECS Tuning, CTS, APR Racing Line, Forge, New Speed, and the P-Flow kit. They've all been used and I've heard good things about those. I haven't tested them myself, so I can't personally vouch for any of those. So please let me know in the comments if you've had experience with any of those brands or if I've missed any brands or recommendations off, and we can pass those on. So when it comes to engine mods for your Volkswagen Scirocco, I'd encourage you to look at the videos that I've done, which go into a lot more detail on the various generations of these engines that were fitted to the Scirocco over the years, because that enabled me to get into the nuts and bolts, the details as far as turbos and fuel upgrades and where the power limits are in each of those engines. This guide is going to be a very general guide to upgrading the power on your Volkswagen Scirocco. So after we've talked about the induction kits, we need really to talk about the exhaust. Getting the exhaust gases out of the engine is just as critical in your Scirocco project as getting the air in the first place. So what can you expect from an exhaust upgrade on the Scirocco? Well, again, it depends on the engine that you've got. The general idea is to remove restrictions in the exhaust. You want those exhaust gases to exit the engine at the fastest velocity possible. Now, the engine is pushing out these exhaust pulses. Don't think of it as a constant stream. I know when you look at the exhaust pipe itself, it seems to have a constant stream, but there's actually pulses coming out of the engine, and that's a good thing. We get a scavenging effect from this. So as each exhaust pulse pushes down the exhaust tube, there is a vacuum that forms just behind that, and that vacuum is actually beneficial to emptying the exhaust from the cylinder and just allows you to get a little bit more fresh air in. If that scavenging effect is lost, i.e. you've got an exhaust size that's too big, you're losing the velocity of the air due to the large bore size. That can have a detrimental effect on the scavenging. So effectively you'll still have some exhaust gases in the engine on the compression stroke. So that can also lead to other problems. So there's very much a lot of consideration that goes into the design system of an exhaust. And generally manufacturers have done a reasonable job when it comes to determining the flow rates of exhaust. But bear in mind, they've optimized it for everyday driving, usually for economy purposes. If you're a performance driver and you spend most of your time in the upper end of the RPM range, there's certainly going to be an advantage there to having a larger bore size. On diesel engines, I never feel a sports exhaust adds much. The diesel engine exhaust note is not fantastic. It's not as good as your average gasoline or petrol powered. So in most cases you want to muffle that. So the benefits you get from that noisier sports exhaust are often outweighed by the inconvenience of driving the car just because it's become very, very drony. So common areas that you should pay attention to on the Scirocco are the catalysts, the DPFs, if you've got a diesel version with a DPF filter fitted. Let's talk about flywheel upgrades on the Volkswagen Scirocco. Are these a good mod? What can you expect from upgrading the flywheel? So the flywheel itself, what's it do? Well, it's a large metal disc, a weight on the side of the engine. And as the engine spins, the flywheel spins. So an engine is never perfect. There's a series of explosions going on at staged intervals. There's a lot of vibration going on in the engine. The components are moving up and down, left and right. There's an awful lot going on inside the engine, and you don't really want that to upset the smooth running of the engine. So the flywheel effectively stores the kinetic energy and just smooths everything out. So in the gaps where nothing is happening explosion-wise in the engine, the flywheel is still rotating the engine assembly, the transmission assembly. So it keeps everything moving smoothly. So the heavier the flywheel is, the less inclined the engine will be to lose RPMs when you drop off the throttle. If the flywheel itself is lighter, the engine revs, the RPM will drop quite suddenly as soon as you ease off. So that can be beneficial in a race situation where, for example, you want to do some rev matching. You want those rev changes to happen very quickly to have maximum control over the engine. But on the long run, you really want the flywheel to maintain momentum. Otherwise, as soon as you hit a hill, you're going to have to make a conscious adjustment on the accelerator for every little fluctuation that you get, whereas the flywheel helps to keep everything smooth. So with some engines, they have a dual mass flywheel, which is essentially two sprung-loaded plates or weights, and they work to really dramatically minimize the amount of vibration going through the transmission from the engine. So a lot of dual mass flywheels start to suffer, they start to break down. The springs, there's a lot of vibration going on in them. They are taking a lot of abuse, but it's better to have that abuse in something that's relatively cheap to replace than in your expensive transmission or other components within the engine. So when people replace the clutch, they generally look to replace the flywheel. If you've got a dual mass flywheel, it is possible to replace it with a single mass flywheel, but on some engines, particularly older diesel engines, that's not always advisable. You really do want that protection from all the vibrations that are going on in the engine. But do ask people who've done this mod, specifically if they've got the same engine as you, and just compare notes. Is it giving you the advantages or the flexibility that you want? Another little plus of having a lighter flywheel is there's less weight in the car. And less weight allows the car to accelerate more quickly. It makes it handle better. So most people for an everyday car would just look to get a slightly lighter flywheel. You can get slightly lighter dual mass flywheels and slightly lighter single mass flywheels for most engines. So when you've been upgrading and tuning your Volkswagen Scirocco, it's a really good idea as well to look at the clutch. The clutch is going to take a beating whatever happens, and if you put significantly more torque and more power through it, it may well be that your old clutch on a high mileage engine is starting to slip. So there's lots of upgrade options. So in terms of clutch upgrades on the Volkswagen Scirocco, I've heard good things about the TVS engineering clutch. There's also various clutches out there from Sachs, and there's also the LUK, the Luck dual mass flywheel. It seems to outperform and outlast the factory fitted ones according to people's opinions after they've had this fitted. I'd be curious to know what your thoughts are on clutch upgrades and flywheel upgrades on the Volkswagen Scirocco. So all of the engines that are offered in the Volkswagen Scirocco are turbocharged, so they need an intercooler. So what does the intercooler do? And will you get power gains on your Volkswagen Scirocco's engine by just changing to a high performance, a bigger, a better flowing intercooler? Let's look at intercoolers and what they actually offer. So the intercooler is basically a radiator, and it takes the compressed air from the turbo and cools it down. Why does it cool it down? Well, when you compress air, it gets very, very hot. The more the air is compressed, the hotter it gets. You've probably noticed that when you pump up your car tyre, the nozzle of the pump starts to get very warm. That's the effect of the compressed air heating up. So you really want that intake charge to be as low as possible when it comes to the intake temperature. So an intercooler effectively exposes that hot compressed air to the ambient air and drops the temperature back down. So you might think that having a massive intercooler will add loads of power, but it doesn't quite work like that. The intercooler size is generally determined by the flow rate of the engine, and you can actually reduce the velocity and the flow rate significantly by going with the wrong intercooler design. Now, a larger intercooler does offer benefits over a smaller stock factory one in that it doesn't heat up as quickly. It will dispel the heat that builds up in the exhaust charge for longer periods of time. So with a lot of factory setups, the small intercooler is barely adequate. And if you're doing a lot of spirited driving, that intercooler itself is starting to get warm. And if the radiator that the hot air is going into is warm, it's not going to be as efficient at cooling it down. So upgrading the intercooler, it doesn't significantly add power. It stops you losing power in that situation where the intercooler has started to get warm itself. So resighting the intercooler, some engines have intercoolers mounted at the side, some they have a water-cooled intercooler where the water is then channeled to the front of the car and cooled down. So just changing the routing, aiding airflow through the intercooler itself can all help to reduce those intake temperatures. A lot depends on the engine you've got and the style of the engine bay of your car and how much scope you've got of maybe adding a larger intercooler at the front. But generally speaking, the front mount intercoolers perform really well. They're relatively cost effective. The downside is the long runs that you have in pipes to feed them. So that's why a lot of manufacturers have a water mounted intercooler mounted quite close to the engine. It's easier to pump the water around than it is to get the air charge moving around the engine bay. And they then expose that water to the ambient air temperature, which reduces the temperature of the water, which is then passed on to that intake charge as it goes into the engine. But we're talking about fairly complex setups there. So intercooler upgrades are usually quite expensive and they don't add significant amounts of power, but it can help to free up power on those higher powered projects. So in terms of large power gains on the Volkswagen Scirocco engines, you've got to talk about remapping the ECU. These tunes that you can adjust in the ECU really do make a big difference. So how do they work? What can you expect from an ECU tune in terms of performance and power gains? The ECU is the computer inside the engine. It's controlling everything to do with the way the engine burns the fuel. So diesel engines and gasoline engines have very, very different setups. They work completely differently. Check out the video on the differences between the two if you're not sure. So a lot of people talk about the factory setting. They've dialed it back about 20%. So they've probably done this to protect the turbo, to increase the fuel economy and to meet emissions regulations. But also they've got to take into account the poor qualities of fuel in different countries, because they just have one setting really for all the different countries, and the varying exhaust emissions regulations in those different regions, and the adverse weather conditions. So some temperatures are much, much cooler than in other areas. So they've created a very generic, very, very safe map. So just tightening that up a little bit can give you that decent extra bit of power. Most people say they get about 20 to 30% more power, which is certainly a noticeable jump in power. And for the cost, it's probably the biggest power gain you can get to the amount of money that you outlay for that power gain. So I would certainly recommend looking into remaps. There's various different options. Some people offer piggyback boxes that plug in between the ECU and the various sensors on the engine. So some of those are really crude in operation, and I would avoid those like the plague. But others are much more complex. They've got microprocessors. They do a lot more thinking for the car, for the ECU. They respond more quickly than the ECU. So they generally don't overfuel. They keep everything running cleanly and nicely within the engine, so you're not clogging up your DPF filter or causing any other problems through the catalysts or other components within the exhaust system. You really can't beat though getting your car set up on a rolling road. So that's why they put your car on a rolling road and they fine-tune the ECU to the exact car that you've got, the engine you've got. So bear in mind that every engine as it comes out of the factory is slightly different. The manufacturing tolerances are never quite as perfect as you might think they are nowadays. They're a lot better than they used to be, but I've seen substantial differences between engines. So maybe one was done on a Friday afternoon after everyone had been at the pub, and the others had been done on maybe a Tuesday morning when everyone's awake and really, really focused on their work. So this all has a bearing really in the various manufacturing and quality control processes that go on in the factory. So getting your car set up will also take into account any other mods that you've done. So if you've done anything to the induction, the air intake, the exhaust as well, or you maybe change the DPF filter if it's legal to do that in your area, or the catalyst, the rolling road tune will just enable you to set the car up precisely to fully release the power in all those different mods that you've done. So the next biggest mod that you will need to do if you want to take power further than having the ECU tune adjusted or remapped is really upgrading the turbo. There's lots of different options out there. Often the variants from other Volkswagen Group cars offer upgrades. So a lot of these engines were offered in various power levels. There may be 150 horsepower and 170 horsepower, or 150 and 190 horsepower. It just depends on the generation of engine you've got. But in very, very general, simple terms, sourcing a turbo from those higher powered variants is a very simple upgrade path which will raise your potential to make more power on your Scirocco's engine. There's also various other turbo upgrade options out there in terms of hybrid turbos or just big turbos. So let's talk about turbo upgrades in general for the Volkswagen Scirocco. And I would encourage you to look at the engine videos that I've put out, because they go into a lot more detail on the nuances of getting more power out of each of these engine versions. So turbocharger upgrades are obviously going to add a lot of power. The turbo is that thing that is compressing the air, allowing more oxygen-laden air to get into the engine. So if you don't have a turbo on the car to start with, it is possible to add an aftermarket turbo, but it is a lot of work. It's normally too expensive for most everyday drivers to consider, although some models will have kits available where you can upgrade the turbos. Adding a different turbo can dramatically alter the profile of the power that is produced from the engine. So generally speaking, larger turbos provide much more power at the top end, but they take a while to get going. The turbines in them are somewhat larger. They need a greater velocity of air to get going, so you experience more lag low down. Now, manufacturers have done clever things with twin scroll turbo designs where the exhaust channels are separated, and that maximizes the velocity, and a lot of these turbos will spool up just as quickly as the smaller factory counterparts. Also, we've got variable vane technology into turbos that alter the angle of the air as it goes into the turbo, which again can aid the velocity and help the turbo to spool up more quickly. So there's also some other considerations. If your car engine has variable valve timing on the exhaust and the intake, you generally see better gains than if it's only got variable valve timing on the intake side, because that affects the velocity going into the turbo. So I've heard from people with some engines that have swapped the turbo to a larger one, they haven't got the variable valve technology on the exhaust side, and it's made the turbo very, very sluggish. It spools up very, very slowly, although they are benefiting from higher power figures at the top end of the RPM range. So going outside of the manufacturer's lineup, you can go for a hybrid turbo, which essentially takes the case of a factory turbo. So it's a swap-in replacement, and they've completely changed the internals. They may even have machined out the inside of the turbo to allow the larger compressor wheels to go in. But there's a lot of potential power on offer for turbo upgrades. It is a bit of a minefield. There's so much to choose from. Generally speaking, I'd recommend that you get a kit, get something that bolts straight onto your engine. You don't want to be doing extensive plumbing and extensive rework, but whenever you change a turbo, whichever of these options you go for, you should get an adjustment inside the computer. It's now having a big change in the availability of air at different points in the RPM range. So speak to your tuner, tell him which turbo you're getting, get his feedback. Hopefully it's something he's familiar with and he can give you a bit more advice as to whether it's suitable for your engine. And I've done lots of other engine specific guides where we actually discuss turbo upgrades, and I've based that on feedback that I've got from my members, feedback from viewers on this channel, and just general research that I've done when looking into upgrading these engines. So if you've got any other tips to pass on, please let me know in the comments. I'm grateful for all of the feedback that we get. We're all here to learn. I certainly learn something new every day, and the more you learn about something, the more you realize there is to learn, and that's very much the case when it comes to turbo upgrades. You may well hit a restriction in the fuel supply of the engine with all of these upgrades. If you're making significantly more power, it's time to upgrade the injectors and the fuel pump, or the high pressure fuel pump, just to make sure that those injectors are able to deliver more power. So a few things that we just need to bear in mind when it comes to upgrading the injectors on the Volkswagen Scirocco. So let's just talk about Volkswagen Scirocco injectors and fuel pump upgrades, what to expect, what areas to look at, how you can get the most power from your upgrade, and what happens really if you don't match your car's need for fuel with the ability to supply that fuel. The whole point of tuning your engine is to get it to burn more fuel. So increasing the injector capacity, so more fuel is going into the engine, is an obvious route to getting more fuel in the engine. But that needs to be supported by the high pressure fuel pump system, the thing that's pressurizing the fuel rail. So in most engines now, you have a fuel rail where the pressurized fuel sits, and the injectors effectively open. The injectors themselves set a spray pattern so the fuel atomizes as it goes into the engine. Some of the modern injectors have much more controllable settings, so you can alter the rates at which they open and really shape the rate of fuel that's going into the engine, and that has advantages when it comes to fuel economy and power. So upgrading the injectors, it's quite a minefield. There's a lot of different options out there, but you really want something that's tried and tested. So go to a specialist that deals with your specific engine and see what they've got in their lineup in terms of fuel injector upgrades. You're generally looking at a CC capacity, the amount of fuel that is injected. So increasing that capacity will deliver more fuel, but you obviously need to make other adjustments and just make sure that the fuel pump itself and the high pressure fuel pump are able to deliver sufficient fuel to the engine. In some cases, you may find that the high performance variants of your engine and even other models in the manufacturer's range offer better injectors. I note that some manufacturers have switched from a 4 nozzle setup to a 5 nozzle setup, and they've changed the injector type in order to maximize that spray pattern. So just dropping in injectors from the same manufacturer can often give you a little bit more headroom when it comes to tuning a car. So with engines, you've generally got port injection where the fuel is squirted into the intake itself. It goes over the valves into the engine where it mixes. And you've got direct injection where the fuel is directly injected into the cylinder, usually at the last moment. There's certainly advantages in both setups, and some of the newer engines that are coming out have both. They have port injection, which does help reduce the carbon buildup on the intake valves. A lot of people have also looked at methanol injection kits where a port injection setup is added to a direct injection setup. So that can supplement the amount of fuel going into the engine. Switching fuel types as well is another way of getting more power. For a lot of these other fuel types, you need to supply a lot more fuel to burn to make the power. So the injector capacity needs to be dramatically increased, but they generally work quite efficiently and quite cleanly. People have used various ethanol mixes. I've done videos that specifically discuss the different fuels and how people get more power out of engines just by swapping the fuel type. So now we've looked at engine mods, we need to look at the handling mods, the things that improve the car's ability to handle, to perform, to corner and to stop effectively. So suspension upgrades. With suspension upgrades on the Scirocco, there are so many brands out there. So iBack, Racing Line, New Speed, KW, ST, and VMAX are all brands that I've heard people say good things about over the years. Let me know in the comments what your thoughts are. There's obviously different price points in terms of suspension upgrades, and the more expensive ones generally perform better. They allow more adjustment than those cheaper ones. The cheaper kits are often optimized for road use, everyday use of the car, so they're often a good option if you just want to improve the factory setup. The suspension on the Scirocco will start to sag and degrade as it gets older, don't we all? So looking to just maybe drop in one of these budget aftermarket options will lift your handling and performance a little bit further, but don't drop the Scirocco too much. When you start dropping the Scirocco, you start to really mess up the geometry of the suspension. Then you need to start looking at the drop links that connect the anti-roll bar, the other suspension components, just to make sure that everything is properly aligned. A lot of companies out there are selling full kits where all the calculations have been done for you, so it's effectively just a bolt-on replacement that you can go out and fit to your Scirocco and have the benefits of better handling and better performance. I would say dropping about 10 to 25, 30 millimeters is optimal. When you start going beyond that, you start to mess things up if you don't know what you're doing, and often the ride quality just becomes too firm and it stops the Scirocco being so enjoyable. Whiteline actually offer a roll center, a bump steer correction ball joint kit that corrects the roll center geometry after you've lowered the car. So that's a good option, particularly if you're going for those larger drops on your Scirocco. So let's talk briefly and generally about brake upgrades on the Volkswagen Scirocco. Obviously, there's lots of other Volkswagen Group cars out there, various Audi sporty models, the RS3, for example. Within the Volkswagen Group, you've also got the R versions of a lot of these engine options out there. And just make sure that the car uses the same platform, because chances are you can then swap those components over with your standard Scirocco ones and have the benefit of larger discs or larger pads or bigger calipers. If you do your research carefully, you can often source these parts from a breaker's yard, and that can be a very, very cheap upgrade. And a lot of people do this when they start to need to replace the old setup on the car because it's degraded due to a higher mileage. And that's a good point really to start looking at just improving the braking ability of your Scirocco. One of the biggest changes you can make to your Scirocco's performance is actually the tyres, so don't overlook the importance of having a decent set of tyres on your car. I'm really recommending the Uniroyal Rain Sports at the moment. It's a brand that I've used on my car. I've been very, very happy with the wet weather and dry weather performance, and also the wear resistance. I've not tried every tyre out there, so I'm probably quite biased in what I say, but please let me know your comments in terms of tyre upgrades on your Volkswagen Scirocco, and let me know what your experience has been with various brands and which ones you actually recommend. So I hope this has been useful to you. It's given you an overview of all the mods. Check out the detailed engine videos that we've got in our guide to all the Volkswagen Group engines, because I go into a lot more detail there in terms of power upgrades, and that will just help you to take your project to the next level. Please boot the like button, because that really does help us to get out there, and I've lined this video up for you that you should find interesting if you want to get the best performance out of your Volkswagen Scirocco. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in this next video.